There are two kinds of neighbors you get in a condo complex. The first kind waves at you in the parking lot, maybe drops off a tin of cookies at Christmas, and otherwise leaves you to live your life in peace. The second kind learns your schedule, memorizes your mail delivery time, and decides somewhere deep in their soul that the hallway outside your unit is an extension of their personal jurisdiction. Margaret Elaine Kowalski, and yes, I will use her full name because she earned it, was very much the second kind. She moved into Unit 4A about 3 years before any of this happened. I noticed her the first week because she was the kind of woman who made herself noticeable. Tall, always in a pressed blouse regardless of the hour, hair that suggested regular salon appointments, and a dedication to appearances that went well beyond personal preference. It was a statement. Everything about Margaret was a statement. The complex has 22 units across 3 floors. It is not a large building. There are 2 stairwells, a shared laundry room in the basement, a small courtyard that nobody really uses except in May, and a parking lot that seats 32 cars if everyone behaves themselves. Most people behave themselves. This is not a story about most people. I had lived in 4B for 6 years before Margaret arrived. 6 years is long enough to know every creak in the hallway floor, every neighbor's television through the wall, and exactly which maintenance issues the HOA would address promptly versus which ones they would forward to a committee and never speak of again. I knew this building. I knew my unit. I had painted the bathroom twice, installed my own light fixtures with HOA approval, and replaced the deadbolt on my front door after the original lock started sticking in winter. That last detail matters. Remember it. Margaret introduced herself on her 3rd day with a fruit basket and a list of concerns, actual concerns, written down. She handed it to me along with a clementine and explained that she had noticed certain issues in the building that she felt the residents should be aware of. The list included the angle of the exterior lighting, the condition of the welcome mat outside Unit 2C, and what she described as an irregular parking pattern in spaces 14 through 17. I thanked her for the clementines. I put the list in the recycling. By the end of her first month, she had attended 2 HOA meetings and been appointed to the Resident Concerns Subcommittee, which, as best I could tell, she had also named. By the end of her 3rd month, she'd been given a position on the Buildings and Grounds Committee, which was a real committee that had existed for years and which, until Margaret joined it, had functioned as a loose group of people who periodically walked around the parking lot and agreed that the hedges looked fine. The HOA manager at the time was a part-time property management contractor named Dale, who worked 3 complexes simultaneously and could generally be relied upon to respond to emails within 5 to 7 business days if the subject line contained the word urgent. Dale found Margaret efficient. Dale found Margaret thorough. Dale, I believe, found Margaret useful in the specific way that overwhelmed people find anyone willing to do work they themselves do not want to do. By the end of her first year, Margaret Kowalski had a master key to the building, not a master key to the common areas, not a key to the mailroom or the laundry or the maintenance closet. A master key. The kind that, in theory, could open any unit in the building. I did not know this yet. None of us did, except Dale. And Dale was not the kind of person who sent out memos about things that might generate questions. I found out the same way most people find out about things in this kind of building. A neighbor told a neighbor who told me in the parking lot on a Tuesday evening, her voice low and her eyebrows doing most of the work. That was when I went home and changed my deadbolt. She showed up the next morning like she owned the place, which, to be fair, was exactly how she'd been acting since the day I moved in. I heard the footsteps in the hall, that particular purposeful click of heels that I'd already learned to recognize, and then the sound that would have made my stomach drop 6 months earlier, but now just made me set down my coffee and wait. The door handle turned. Nothing happened. She tried it again, a little harder this time, like the lock might change its mind if she applied the right amount of confidence. I stood in my kitchen and listened to her work through the stages. The initial rattle, the pause, the second rattle, slower, more deliberate, the kind that says, I know what I'm doing, and this is merely a formality. Then the real sound, the scrape of metal on metal as she actually produced the master key and slid it into the deadbolt. I want you to understand something about that moment. The master key is the HOA's whole theology. It is the physical object that makes someone like her feel like the rules of private property bend a little differently around her. She'd mentioned it twice in the previous month, once when she was telling me about a leak in Unit 6C, and once for no particular reason at all, just dropping it into conversation the way some people mention their degrees or their connections. She had access. She wanted me to know she had access. The deadbolt didn't move. I had installed it myself 8 weeks prior, a Saturday morning project that had taken longer than expected because I read the entire manual and watched 2 instructional videos before I touched a single screw. It was a secondary lock, properly permitted in full compliance with the HOA bylaws as they were written, not as she'd been interpreting them verbally in the parking lot and the elevator, but as they were actually written in the document I downloaded from the county recorder's office and read twice with a highlighter. The master key worked on the original lock. I hadn't touched the original lock, but the deadbolt I'd added was keyed separately, registered to me, permitted by the building code, and there wasn't a master key in existence that would open it. She tried it 3 more times. I counted. Then silence, the particular kind of silence that has decision-making happening inside it. I refreshed my email out of habit. Nothing yet. I went back to my coffee and gave her the time she apparently needed to reach whatever conclusion she was in the process of reaching in the hallway outside my door. I didn't feel triumphant exactly. It was more like watching a math problem resolve the way it was always going to resolve. Knowing the arithmetic had been solid from the beginning. What I did not expect, and this is the part that still gets me when I think about it, was what she did next. She didn't knock. She didn't slide a note under the door. She didn't go downstairs and compose a strongly worded email to the HOA board, which would have at least been the predictable next move. She did not consult the bylaws, or call a property manager, or take any of the obvious procedural steps available to her. She called 911. I know this because I heard her voice change in the hallway, dropping into that particular register people use when they want to sound like a victim explaining something to an authority figure. I heard the words unauthorized modification and refused entry, and I represent the association. I heard her give the address. I put my coffee mug in the sink, walked to my desk, and pulled out the folder I'd started keeping 3 months ago. It had tabbed sections. I'm telling you this not to brag, but because the folder is important to the rest of the story, and I want you to know it existed before the knock came, not after. She tried the key on a Tuesday. I know it was Tuesday because I had taken the afternoon off work. One of those rare quiet days where I was just going to sit on my couch and do absolutely nothing productive. The dishes were in the sink. I was in sweatpants. I had a cup of coffee going cold on the end table. It was exactly the kind of afternoon that feels stolen from the rest of your life. And I was protective of it, the way you get protective of small good things. I heard her in the hallway first. That specific sound of someone walking with purpose, heels on tile, the little metallic jingle of a keyring. I didn't think much of it. People walk through hallways. That is what hallways are for. Then I heard her stop outside my door. There's a particular quality to silence that happens right outside your front door when someone is standing there. You become aware of the gap beneath it. You become aware of the fact that there is only a few inches of wood and hardware between you and whatever is happening on the other side. I sat very still on my couch and listened. The knock didn't come first. That's what I want you to understand. There was no knock. There was just the sound of a key going into a lock. Now, A standard lock on these units isn't much. The builder-grade hardware that came with the place was the kind of thing you'd replace inside of a year, if you had any sense. I had replaced mine about 3 weeks after I moved in. Not because I was paranoid. Not because I had anticipated anything like this. I had replaced it because the original wobbled when you turned it, and I am the kind of person who finds that sort of thing quietly unbearable. What I had put in was a good deadbolt, a real one. The kind with a hardened steel bolt and a reinforced strike plate and a cylinder that wasn't going to be persuaded by anything short of a legitimate key or a very determined crowbar. I had also added a secondary lock, a simple bar mechanism, the kind you slide into place from the inside. It wasn't fancy. It cost about $14, but it meant that even if someone had the right key, the door wasn't opening without my cooperation. I heard the key turn. I heard it catch on nothing. There was a pause. Then I heard it again. The same motion, slightly more deliberate, like maybe the first attempt had just been a fumble. The lock did what good locks do. It held. What happened next is the part I still think about, because it tells you everything about the kind of person she was. She didn't knock. She didn't announce herself. She didn't say, "Hello, I'm trying to do a maintenance check," or "I need access to this unit. Please come to the door." She rattled the handle. Twice, with the specific energy of someone who is genuinely confused that the world is not cooperating with them. I sat on my couch in my sweatpants with my cold coffee and I did not move. Eventually, the rattling stopped. I heard the heels again, retreating down the hallway. And then I heard what I can only describe as the sound of someone making a decision. That particular shift in footstep rhythm, when a person has moved from confused to resolved, from inconvenienced to aggrieved. I didn't know yet what she was going to do next. I just knew she was going to do something. People like that always do. The world said no to them, and they take it personally. Like the lock had insulted her specifically. Like the deadbolt had opinions about her character. I picked up my coffee. Still cold. I drank it anyway, and sat there thinking about how $14 had just turned out to be one of the better investments I'd made all year. She called the police. I want you to let that sit for a second before I explain the rest of it. Not because it needs dramatic emphasis, but because when I tell people this part, there's always a pause, a little recalibration, like their brain has to gently set down whatever reasonable expectation they were holding and pick up the actual facts of what happened. She called the police because my deadbolt worked. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I know it was Tuesday because I'd taken a half day. One of those rare quiet ones where you actually manage to read something and drink a full cup of coffee before it goes cold. I was on my couch. The television was low. And then I heard it. That particular sound of a key being worked into a lock with some confidence behind it. Not tentative, purposeful. I already knew what it was. After the last 2 attempts, I had started to recognize the specific acoustic signature of Sandra believing she had the right to be somewhere she did not. There's a rhythm to it. Insert, turn, resistance, confusion. Then it comes again, a little harder, like the lock might have made a mistake the first time, and just needs to be corrected. I did not get up. I will be honest with you about that. I sat there, and I listened to her try that key 4 times, and I felt something I can only describe as deeply boring satisfaction. The kind you feel when something you prepared for actually works exactly the way it was supposed to. Then it stopped. 15 minutes later, there was a knock at my door. Not Sandra. 2 officers from the county sheriff's department, both of them carrying the particular expression of people who had been told something on the way over and were already revising their expectations based on what they were actually looking at. One of them asked if I was the resident of the unit. I said yes. He asked if I was aware there had been a complaint filed. I said I was not, but I had a guess. The complaint, as it was explained to me with a kind of barely managed neutrality, was that I had installed an unauthorized lock that was preventing building management from conducting a wellness check. A wellness check. Sandra had told the responding officers that she'd been unable to reach me, that she had reason to believe I might be in distress, and that her master key, the one that gave her access to all units in her capacity as a board member, had failed to open my door. She had presented this as a safety emergency. I asked the officer if he would like to come inside. He said that would be helpful, yes. I opened the door wider and he stepped in and looked around at a man who was very plainly fine, standing in a living room with a half-read book on the couch cushion and a coffee mug on the end table. He looked at me. He looked at the room. He looked back at me. I handed him the letter I had sent to the HOA board 6 weeks earlier, the one documenting my installation of the secondary lock, citing the specific provision in our CC and Rs that permitted residents to add supplemental security hardware to their unit doors, provided it did not damage the frame or interfere with fire egress. I had looked that up carefully. I had quoted the subsection number. I had sent it certified mail and kept the return receipt. He read it. He read it again. He handed it back. His partner had stayed near the door and had not said anything yet. She spoke now. She said, very quietly, that they were going to go speak with the individual who had placed the call. I thanked them for coming. I meant it, not sarcastically. They had done their jobs. They showed up. They looked at the situation. They assessed it. What happened next was between them and Sandra. I closed the door, picked up my book, and waited. The phone rang at 9:47 on a Tuesday morning, and I almost didn't answer it because I didn't recognize the number. I'm glad I did. Not because the call went well for anyone involved, but because some conversations need to happen so you can understand exactly what you're dealing with. It was Diane, not the HOA board, not a property manager, not anyone with a title or a clipboard or even a pretense of official capacity. Diane, my neighbor, calling my personal cell phone to explain to me why I was wrong about my own front door. I let her talk. That's the thing people don't understand about these situations. You as the landing. You have to let them talk, because they will always say more than they intend to. She started with the reasonable version of herself. She was just concerned, she said. The master key policy existed for everyone's safety, she said. There had been a water leak 2 years ago before I moved in, and if the board hadn't been able to access that unit, it could have been so much worse. She was warm, she was neighborly, she was performing a version of herself that she clearly believed I would find reassuring. I said, Then she got to the part about the deadbolt, my deadbolt specifically, the one I had installed, the one that, as she put it, was preventing the building from being able to properly maintain itself. I asked her to send me the section of the CC and Rs that addressed secondary lock installations. There was a pause. Not a long one, but the kind that tells you everything. She said she didn't have them in front of her right now. I said that was fine. I had them right here, and I read her the relevant section, which said nothing. Nothing about secondary locks. Nothing about deadbolts. Nothing that would give any board member, elected or otherwise, the right to demand access to a privately owned unit outside of a documented emergency. She pivoted. She said the 911 call had been a misunderstanding. The officer had been called because there was concern about my welfare. She said I had been unreachable. I asked her when, exactly, she had attempted to reach me before calling the police. Another pause. Longer this time. She said she had knocked. Once, I said. You knocked once. She did not confirm or deny this. She moved on to telling me that she hoped we could handle this between ourselves, neighbor to neighbor, without involving anyone else. That phrase, without involving anyone else, is doing a lot of work in a sentence like that. It is the sound of someone who has realized that the official channels are not going to help them, and is now trying to talk you out of using the official channels yourself. I told her I appreciated the call. I told her I understood her concerns. I told her that going forward, any communication about building access or unit policies should come in writing through the board, and I would respond in kind. She started to say something about how that seemed very formal for neighbors. I agreed with her. I said it did seem formal. I said I thought that was probably appropriate, given that she had called the police to my home over a lock on my door. She hung up shortly after that. I sat with the phone in my hand for a minute. There was no satisfaction in it yet. That would come later, and slowly, the way it always does when things go right for the right reasons. What I felt in that moment was something quieter, a kind of clarity. I knew exactly what this was now. I knew exactly who I was dealing with. And I knew, the way you sometimes just know things, that I had better start keeping records. So I opened my email and wrote myself a summary of the call. Time, date, everything she said, as close to verbatim as I could manage. I sent it to myself with the subject line, Documentation, Diane call, Tuesday. It was the first entry in a folder that would eventually contain 31 items. The HOA for Maplewood Commons came with a 3-ring binder. That should have been the first warning sign. Not a welcome packet, not a pamphlet. A binder tabbed and indexed with a laminated cover that read Community Standards and Governing Documents in a font that meant business. Sandra Pelham handed it to me the day I moved in like she was bestowing something sacred. I thanked her, set it on the kitchen counter, and didn't open it for 2 weeks. She had opened hers clearly. She had read it, highlighted it, and somewhere along the way convinced herself that it had made her important. That's the thing about HOA documents that certain people never quite understand. The rules exist to protect the community. All of it. Every unit, every owner, every person paying dues into the same pool. The bylaws are not a management contract. The Community Standards Handbook is not a badge. And the role of neighborhood liaison, a volunteer position Sandra had held for going on 4 years by the time I moved in, carries exactly as much authority as the board explicitly grants it, and not one syllable more. I know this now because I read the binder, cover to cover, twice. After the 911 call, I had a lot of time to sit with it. The relevant sections weren't hard to find once I knew what I was looking for. Article 4 covered member rights, and it was unambiguous on the question of unit access. No board member, officer, or designated representative could enter a privately owned unit without written notice, delivered no fewer than 48 hours in advance, except in cases of documented emergency. The definition of emergency was also right there in plain language: active fire, water intrusion affecting neighboring units, or situations presenting immediate threat to life or safety. A deadbolt that Sandra personally found inconvenient did not qualify under any of those headings. The master key policy was covered separately, in an addendum that had been adopted by the board 3 years before I moved in. The master key, one existed for the building's shared spaces and utility access points, was to be held by the property management company, not by any individual resident or liaison. Requests for access using that key had to go through the management company and required the same 48-hour written notice. Sandra did not work for the property management company. Sandra was a volunteer. I wrote all of this down. Not in anger, though I won't pretend I wasn't angry. I wrote it down because when you're dealing with someone who has convinced herself that she operates inside a different set of rules than everyone else, the only useful response is to become more precise than she is. She had the confidence. I needed the documentation. The formal complaint I filed with the board wasn't long. 4 pages, including attachments. I cited the specific articles by number. I included the timeline, the knock, the attempt, the call to the non-emergency line, the direct call to my cell, all of it logged with times. I attached the relevant sections of the bylaws as exhibits, which felt a little formal for what was essentially a neighbor dispute, but I had learned by then that formal was the only language this particular situation understood. What I did not do was accuse Sandra of being a bad person. I didn't need to. The facts, laid out in order, did that work on their own. The board president called me 4 days later. His voice had the careful quality of a man who had received this kind of complaint before and was choosing his words with some effort. He said he appreciated me bringing this to their attention. He said the board took member rights seriously. He said there would be a review. I said I appreciated that, thanked him for his time and hung up. Then I made a copy of everything and put it in a folder. Because when you're dealing with someone who doesn't think the rules apply to her, you don't stop at the first yes. You wait to see what happens next. By the time the HOA board meeting rolled around that Thursday evening, I had everything in a folder. Not a mental folder, not a vague intention to bring things up. An actual manila folder with a binder clip and page numbers I'd written in pencil in the upper right corner of each sheet. 12 pages total. I'd counted them twice. Margaret was already seated when I walked in, third chair from the left. The one closest to the window she always picked, so the light caught her silver hair in a way that made her look important. She had a legal pad. She had a pen she kept clicking. She did not have 12 pages. The board president, a retired civil engineer named Don Howell, who genuinely did not enjoy any of this, called the meeting to order at 7:02. There were 6 other residents there besides Margaret and me. 2 of them I recognized as people she'd complained to at the mailboxes. I noted that. It didn't worry me. When the floor opened for resident concerns, Margaret stood up before I could and launched into it. The unauthorized lock modification, the security risk, the precedent it set. She used the word precedent 3 times in 90 seconds, which told me she'd practiced. She said that a resident who changed their own hardware was essentially declaring themselves outside the community, which was a strange thing to say, but she said it with real conviction. Don looked at me when she finished. He had the look of a man who had sat through a lot of these. I stayed seated. I decided that in advance too. I said that I understood Margaret's concern and that I'd like to address it directly. And then I opened the folder. First page. The relevant section of the CC and RS, which I'd printed from the document on the HOA's own website. The language around unit modifications requires board approval for structural changes. A deadbolt on an interior door, the kind that operates only from inside the unit, does not meet the definition of structural under any reading I could find. I said that clearly, and I didn't editorialize. Second page. The email I'd sent to the property management company 6 weeks prior, asking for clarification on exactly this point. Third page. Their response, which confirmed that interior security hardware did not require approval. Margaret said that wasn't the point. I said I understood, and then I got to the actual point. The master key. I asked calmly whether the board was aware that a resident had a master key to the building's units. I asked whether that was consistent with the insurance policy. I slid a copy of the relevant insurance rider to Don. I had brought 5 copies total. I handed them down the row. The clicking pen stopped. Don read the page. He read it again. He asked Margaret where she'd gotten a master key. She said the previous property manager had given it to her years ago for emergencies. Don asked what kind of emergencies. The question hung there for a moment. I didn't say anything. I had learned by then that silence, properly placed, does more work than any sentence I could have constructed. The meeting ran another 40 minutes. There was a motion. There was a second. There was a recorded vote. The board authorized the retrieval of all non-standard keys held by residents. Don said he would handle it personally. He said it in a tone that meant the conversation with Margaret would not be a pleasant one. I drove home and put the folder on my kitchen table. I didn't feel triumphant exactly. I felt something quieter than that. The satisfaction of a thing done correctly, of having shown up prepared to a fight that someone else had started, and of having let the documentation do what documents are supposed to do. My deadbolt was still on the door. It had never been the problem. It had just been the excuse. The meeting was scheduled for 7 o'clock on a Tuesday. Margaret had requested it herself, which told me everything I needed to know about how confident she felt going in. I arrived 4 minutes early with a manila folder, 2 pens, and a printed copy of the HOA bylaws I had ordered from the county recorder's office 3 weeks prior. The copy Margaret kept circulating at board meetings had pages missing. I had not mentioned this to anyone yet. There were 6 people seated around the folding table in the community room. Margaret sat at the head of it, which was not her designated seat. The board president, a quiet retired teacher named Don, sat 2 chairs to her left, looking like a man who had already apologized for something he had not done yet. The remaining 4 were board members and 1 property manager named Curtis, who drove in from a regional office and looked like he would rather be anywhere else on earth. Margaret opened by saying she wanted to address what she called a pattern of non-compliance regarding Unit 4B. I let her finish. She had a list. She read from it. There was the matter of my deadbolt, which she described as an unauthorized modification. There was the matter of my refusal to grant access during what she called a routine inspection. There was the matter of my behavior during what she called an emergency welfare check, which was her new name for the afternoon she had called the police, because I changed my locks. When she was done, I asked Don if I could respond. He said yes quickly, like he had been waiting for someone to give him permission to do something. I started with the deadbolt. I read aloud from Article 7, Section 3 of the actual bylaws, which specified that unit owners may install additional security hardware provided it does not alter the structural integrity of the common entryway. A deadbolt on an interior unit door does not touch a common entryway. I slid a copy across the table to Curtis, who read it without expression and set it down. Then I addressed the inspection. I asked Margaret to show me the written notice she had provided 72 hours in advance, as required by Article 9. She said inspections of this nature did not require written notice. I asked her to show me where in the bylaws it said that. The room got quiet in a specific way that rooms get quiet when someone realizes a conversation has changed shape. Curtis cleared his throat and asked to see my copy of the bylaws. I gave him one. He flipped to Article 9 and read it in silence for a moment. Then he asked Margaret when the written notice had been sent. She said she had spoken to me directly, which he noted was not the same thing. I saved the police call for last. I had the incident report. I had the responding officer's name and badge number. I had a written statement from him noting that no emergency existed and that the call appeared to stem from a neighbor dispute. I laid it on the table and left it there. Don asked if there was anything else. I said there was one more thing, and I unfolded the last page in my folder, which was a formal complaint I had prepared against Margaret for harassment, improper use of master key access, and filing a false emergency report. I asked that it be entered into the official HOA record. Margaret started to say something about community standards. Curtis put his hand up in a way that was not rude, but was very final. The meeting ended 20 minutes later. The board voted 3-1 to table any compliance action against Unit 4B pending a full bylaw review. Don thanked everyone for coming. Curtis shook my hand on the way out and did not say anything, but the handshake said enough. Margaret left without speaking. I held the door open for her on the way out. She did not look at me. I drove home, made tea, and sat with the quiet for a while. Some wins don't need celebrating. They just need witnessing.